This is a little presentation I used to provide for my students whenever I was teaching over at the college level, and there was an awful lot of different things that you need to know about rear axle assemblies, and of course the front axle assembly is four-wheel drive. I'm not going to talk a lot about the differential / final drive part of the front wheel drive vehicles, because those are different kind of gears and there's some slightly different rules there. Some of the things are the same, like gear ratios and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a few stories and give you a little bit of a few pointers about the rear axle stuff. And I've borrowed some illustrations from the internet, but right here you've got all of these different names. What are you going to do with all this information about what you call all this stuff? This is pretty good. Here you top land, toe, drive side of pinion, root, heel, coast side, flank. That's all good stuff. But that's basically, if you're looking at those gears, unless you're some sort of a real serious engineer-driven gearhead, you really don't need to, try to burn all those in so you can talk about them. Unless you're talking to somebody on the phone and you want to talk about the gear without having an illustration there. But nowadays, you can look at your phone or get on Zoom and you can talk to people and actually point to a picture. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to, teach you what to call all these various different things on here. But differential service is something that I used to deal with whenever I was talking to my students. I would tell them basically if the differential is leaking, it's kind of like a manual transmission. If it's leaking, there's no indicator that you have that it's low on fluid. If you're not paying attention to spots on the pavement, or if you're not looking under there to see if you see grease dripping off of components, you don't know it's leaking until you start hearing noise. And so it's really important to keep an eye on that. And any closed gearbox, depending on whether it's on the rear end or whether it's on the, if it's an automatic transmission or if it's a manual transmission or whatever it is going to have a vent. If that vent clogs up, then it's going to cause you problems in the way of leaks. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. Alright, so rear differential service for regular maintenance or for repair work, like replacing leaking seals, and often involve removing the rear axles and draining the fluid and all that. But now you don't have to do all that if you're just going to replace the pinion seal. And I do have a video that I'll point out a little bit later toward the end of the presentation where I show you how to go about replacing the differential seal without getting things out of adjustment. The first time I ever dealt with a with a rear wheel drive set of gears and I don't even remember why I was changing them, but I was doing fleet maintenance down there, and it was in like 1977. And I was, or it may have been 78, but anyway, long and short of it was, I had some gears, and I just went ahead and put a set of gears in it. I didn't pay any attention to how they were set up or anything. I figured you just bolt the things in there, and then you would be okay. So I went ahead and did that, and when I drove that thing down the road, after I just bolted the gears in and put it all back together and tightened up, that was the singingest, whiningest rear end I think I've ever heard. And so I said, my goodness. So I went ahead and came back and I did some research and I figured out how to do it the right way. And basically you have to, the pinion depth has to be right, the backlash has to be right, and the preload on all the bearings has to be correct. And you're actually supposed to measure the preload using an inch-pound torque wrench, not what it takes to get the assembly moving. This is without the axles in it now. Or you can have the axles in it, but you don't need to have the brake drums and stuff on it when you're measuring the turn-in torque of the rear end, because you don't want the brakes, fouling up your torque reading. But one of the things that I taught my students how to do was to set up the rear end and measure the backlash with a dial indicator and all that kind of thing. And it was amazing to me how I could explain that, and I could even demonstrate it. And some of them, when they went to set the dial indicator up, they'd have the dial indicator set up totally wrong, and I never really understood. Sometimes you don't know what people understand when you're trying to teach them until you see that they're doing something wrong that you thought you had taught them to do right, Alright, now, differentials on linear platforms, and when I say linear platforms, I mean the engine is running the, north-south instead of east-west, like a pickup or a big car and all that. They're very straightforward units that haven't changed much in over the 70 years. But this is what totally amazed me when I ran into a situation over at the school. We had to put spider gears, these gears here, the differential gears in the center of the thing, in 2 trucks. We had to put some in a Ford truck and we had to put some in a Chevy truck. And they were those two jobs came in real close to one another. And look at the difference in the price. On the Ford, and this was from the dealer, now this was OE, it was $52.57 for this set of gears. Now this set of GM gears doesn't look that much different, and they even came without these, but they were $423. Now I will tell you, 500 something is what we wound up paying back when we were doing this. But why on a GM you're paying this much more than that? I mean 10 times almost the cost from Ford to GM for the same basic gears, because these gears aren't any better than those. Remember, we were replacing some on a Chevy that failed too. So I mean, why do they want so much more money for these than they do those? That just totally blew me away, because when somebody came and said we need some, you're just about better off on a Chevy to find you a junkyard rear end, or a salvage yard rear end. I mean, the salvage yard people and the used parts people don't like being called junkyards. But anyway, I would say, you can usually buy for $500. You can buy a rear axle. Now, if you're working with 4-wheel drive, the front axle and the rear axle both have to have the same gear ratio. Just like all the tires on a 4-wheel drive need to be the same size and about the same wear level and all that. All right, you better pay attention to the kind of oil you're using too. It's really interesting to me. I'm figuring, well, these are just gears, unless you got those little sets of clutches and plates in there on the ones that have positive traction or limited slip or whatever you want to call it. And it would seem to me like oil and gears is oil and gears, But if you don't want to find yourself liable, if you're working on a differential on somebody's pickup truck or whatever, you better find out what kind of differential it calls, what kind of differential it calls for, and you better get that kind. Some of them call for synthetic lube differential oil that's like $17 a pint. And whenever we were doing a job like that over at college, I always make sure that we put that kind of oil in there. And one time we had to put like 3 pints of oil in there, and it was, I don't know, it wound up being $40 or $50 for the oil. And the business office called and says, why in the world does it cost $50 for 3 pints of differential oil? I said, because that's synthetic differential oil and it's expensive stuff. But there are these stinking limited slip additives. If you've ever smelled of that limited slip additive, you can buy some of that at the parts store. And if you don't put limited slip additive in these that have the little clutches and they got the big S spring in the middle and all, what'll happen when you're going around curves is it'll go jump, 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 because those things will chatter. I've actually seen brand new Ford vehicles come in that had limited slip, and you can feel it, jumping and chattering when you were in a turn because those clutches weren't slipping smoothly. And so then you'd have to put some of that limited slip in there. Once you did that, it would smooth it right up and all. Anyway, that's just here and there. Make sure you're using the right oil, and if it's limited slip and it requires that, you need to research that. Don't just figure VI8 and just squirt any kind of oil in there you want to. That's really important. Now, the gear ratios are something that you need to be looking at. A lot of the people that do, racing and stuff, they will actually study up on this big time. And you're basically looking at how many times this gear has to turn before this gear makes a full turn. All right. Now, I got a very brief story to tell you about my, back in 1978, I bought a 74 Ford pickup truck. And I had been driving Volkswagen Squareback, because I was, figured I was going to save gas or whatever. You got to remember, in the summer of 1978, gas was 40 cents a gallon, 40 to 45, depending on where you went. But whenever Jimmy Carter deregulated everything, and he said in his speech, and I still remember it, he said gas is going to go to $1 a gallon, and immediately the oil companies all jacked the gas price up to $1 a gallon. And of course, then the government was starting to talk about hitting them with windfall profits taxes to keep them from making too much money, But the end of the story, the long and the short of that is, what you got there is you got a situation where I was getting about, and I don't know why that truck was getting such horrible fuel economy because it ran good. I was getting something like 7 miles to the gallon. Okay, and so that was okay when you're only paying $6 for a tank of gas. That wasn't such a bad thing. And I'm telling you, when that thing was bone dry, I filled it up, it cost $6 to fill it up. I was thinking, oh man, I was getting a tank of gas for that VW Squareback for $3. But not anymore, you know. So I said, well, after it went up to $1 a gallon, I started trying to figure out ways, because I was driving 32 miles one way to work. I wanted to get that thing straightened out so that I could get better fuel economy. I put headers on it, I put a screen under the carburetor, I did all kinds of stuff. Finally, what I wound up doing was I did I went to get a differential. It had 332 gears in it, and it had a Rockwell rear end where you pull the axles out and then you just lift the chunk out of there. See, so you didn't actually have to do a lot of work to change the differential ratio on that one back in those days. And so there was a Ranchero at the salvage yard over there that had 275 gears in it. And so I says, well, if I put a different gear ratio in there, then I should get better fuel economy. Well, I went from 332s to 275s, and that thing doubled my fuel economy. It went from 7 to 14 miles to the gallon, and I could handle that. Now the speedometer was off a little bit, you know, and I, you know, worked around that and put a different gear in driving the cable and all that. Let me see if I can get rid of this. All right, now then. But if you're wanting to race, you know, you're basically going to want some of your gears that are like, you know, whenever you say 411 gears, that means you got 4.1 turns of the pinion to 1 turn of this, and that gives you more, you know, when you get on it. See, higher top speed is a higher gear ratio, then you get better mileage per gallon with high gear. Now see, depending on what you call high and low, see that with the way they got the graph on, I would call a high gear ratio the one where this doesn't turn as fast. I mean, that's just the opposite in the way that whoever created this. This is slower off the line. See, that's 331, 355, 373, 410, and 430. The farther you go in this direction, the more torque you're going to have. And you're going to be quicker off the line, you're going to get fewer miles to the gallon. I went this way, and I went to a 275, even below that on my pickup. And it made a huge difference in my fuel economy. I think the guy charged me $25 just to swap. You know, there was nothing wrong with my rear end. I just wanted one that was different. And it had to have the right number of splines, you know, because there was little stuff like that going on you got to pay attention to. Now here's another little story. There was a floating axle. I'm going to talk about floating axle in a minute, but there was a 78 F350 that belonged to the company down there, the fleet maintenance company. And one of the, you know, the big nuts and bearings and all that actually are on the axle tube. That supports the weight of the vehicle, and then the axle that's went out to that plate that's bolted to the hub is what drives the truck forward in space. See that those big old thick axles that are bolted around there that you see like on 3/4 ton pickups and up. All right, so on this axle tube, which is this big tube that goes in there to the differential housing, one of those big nuts broke. This actually popped, and the other nut, because it didn't have that nut, they usually have 2 nuts locked together with a washer between them and a tang bent over. That thing worked loose, and the bearings was letting the axle flex. Okay, it actually let the axle flex until it broke the axle right out there next to the plate that bolts onto the hub, and it tumbled around, and chunks of it, you know, just ruined that thing. And I had to go through, you know, heaven and earth to get that hub off of there, because it had swelled that tube where it ruined the threads, where the chunks of metal that broke off the axle rolled around on the inside. It kind of spread out. If I'd have been thinking more clearly about this, I'd have drawn a picture of it so you see what I'm talking about. But one way or another, that axle housing had to be replaced. There was absolutely no way to fix that. And so I got a hold of the people at the Ford, and of course the company I was working for had tons of money. I don't know why I didn't buy a brand new one. But I says, I got a hold of them. They wanted nearly $1,000 for just that empty housing with no gears in it. And I said, well, let me think about that. And so I found an empty housing that was just exactly the right one. And I don't know if it was a year Model 2 or off, but it was for the same rear end. Everything was the same. I got that thing, I set it up on the, and this was after I had the debacle with the Plymouth that I've screwed up, just bolted the gears in there and all. By this time I knew how to set the gears up, because it ain't really all that hard, but you got to pay attention to what you're doing. You got to know the steps to take. Anyway, I got that thing. When I put the gears, our existing gears, because they weren't hurt, into that thing, the carrier, this is the carrier, the axles come in this way. This is, and I didn't want to draw all those teeth in paint whenever I made this. This is a ring gear. And the ring gear bolts onto this piece right here. All right, when I put all that together and I tried to set the backlash, I could not move the ring gear far enough away from the pinion so that when I put the rear end together, it wouldn't just lock up, because there was no, the backlash adjustment was all the way and it wouldn't move. Well, fortunately, we had a lathe over there, and I took that differential housing right there, and I measured it, and it was real beefy and thick here. And I calculated how much I needed removed from this surface right over here. See that surface right there? This surface right here where the gear bolts onto needed to be thinner so that gear could go farther in that direction, so I could increase the backlash so it wouldn't lock up. So I took all of the gears and everything, and I cleaned this thing up real good, got all the oil off of it, steam cleaned it and everything. And I took it over to the guy that was running the lathe. We had a lathe over there, and the guy could do just about anything. And I said, Dee, I need you to, his name was Dee Crane, I said, I need you to chuck this up in your lathe, and I need you to take 125 thousandths of an inch off of this flange here where this gear bolts on here. And so fortunately I had that, had a guy with a lathe right there in house. And so he chucked that thing up, and he took 125 thousandths, the eighth of an inch is what that is off there. I bolted that thing back together, put that gear on there, had just the right amount of backlash. It was in a, of course I set the pinion depth and all that by painting the gears and turning it through and making the adjustments and all that stuff. And that thing was absolutely perfect when I got done. And I think we paid like $200 for that used housing as opposed to $950 or $1,000 for the new one from the Ford place and all. Anyway, all right, so this right here is a semi-floating axle, and that's a full floating axle like I was talking about. See how this right here, the bearings are actually on the outside of the axle tube, and there's no bearing connected to this. It actually provides the torque that spins these wheels going down the road. Now occasionally you'll see some of these on some of the heavier equipment, the bigger trucks, that have these little split cones in there underneath the nuts, and those are kind of a pain to get out of there sometimes. You got to tap on them and all that, and let them cones loosen up where you can get them out and all that. I ain't gonna spend a lot of time talking about that, but I've done a lot of these kind of work. This is in here is where the two nuts, the bearings go in there facing each other, conical bearings. They go in there, and then you tighten the big nut. You've got to have a big socket. They got a big stamped steel socket you use for that. I got sets of those. Tighten that thing up and to a certain torque. You got to have a little bit of preload on those bearings. I don't want it too much on there. And the oil that oils those bearings, you don't pack them with grease. The oil actually comes out of the runs out this through this axle tube, and it keeps them wet with oil and grease all the time. And of course, you got to have a gasket behind this, all right. Now this one here is one that somebody had put that red junk, that red silicone on it, but it twisted off. That was some seriously heavy torque that twisted that axle off like that. You can see what happened right there. And that's one of those floating axles, full floating axles. One floating axle means this right here is only being used to drive the vehicle. It's not supporting the weight. Now you can see these nuts in here. This axle tube is what supports the weight of the truck. And that's on 3/4 ton trucks and up. Typically you're going to see floating axles like that because they'll carry more weight than one where the axle itself is carrying the weight of that. This is usually pretty simple to take apart. You can even do it with the wheel still on the truck. You can just take that out of there. Since the axle tube is supporting the weight of the vehicle, you can take this out of here and just pull it out and all that. Now, once again, this is a semi-floating axle right here because the weight of the vehicle is being carried by this axle, and there's bearing in there. Some of these will actually have the inner bearing race, like on some of your Fords and stuff. The rollers on the bearing will actually be rolling on the axle, and occasionally if you see the axle itself is brindled right there where those rollers roll, then you actually have to replace the axle assembly. And these, there's various different ways of replacing those bearings. You know, we did some on a Toyota Tundra not long before I left the college, and those were a real booger bear to change. Some of them are harder than others, so they're not all hard, but you just never know. You know, if you're doing a platform you're not familiar with, you need to go in there and research it and don't get into trouble. But a lot of the times they'll have a collar on there that you have to split with a chisel and get it off of there, and then you know, I like to split, when I've got a bearing like that I'm going to be replacing anyway, I like to basically get my high-speed cutter and scribe it, and then get a chisel and tap it, and when it breaks you can just slide it off over your hand instead of having to pull it off. I also do that replacing them, those front wheel, the hub bearings on front wheel drive vehicles. I'll actually bust the inner bearing shaft, you know, cut it a little bit with just cut it just enough to weaken it in one spot with your high-speed cutter, and then you take your chisel and hit it right there. You know, make sure you're wearing safety glasses and all, and you can pop that thing loose and get it off there real easy. 3 types of stress. Torsion stress is twisting, tensile stress is pulling, and shear stress is basically whenever you're trying to, you know, cut it in two like you would with scissors and all that. This probably happened because that C-clip failed, either that or because this axle broke right out here. You know, but that's that C-clip in there. What you got to do whenever you take those spider gear shaft out of the middle of that, you got to pull that out and roll those spider gears out of there. And then what you're going to do is you're going to push this in, and then that's going to, that C-clip you can just pull off over your fingers. You can do that on both sides and all that. So that could be C-clip failure. How about this one here? Somebody was coondogging that thing. That's one of the things that, you know, this one here, this is 4-wheel drive stuff right here is what this is. And somebody really, that's a terrible mess there that needs to be fixed. When the axle's weak by design, sometimes they'll pop right there, or it'll get fatigued, or maybe it'll have, maybe it was too weak to begin with, you know, in that one spot because of flaws in the metal or the casting or whatever. And then right here, somebody put a sleeve on there and tried to tack weld it a little bit, and that really didn't get the job done. That one there came apart, you know. But this is what I was talking about right here. This little collar right here is what you got to, if you're going to replace that bearing, you got to bust that collar off of there. And at the Ford place, they used to have a big tube-looking slide hammer. Now you can put that in a press if you got a tall enough press and press all that back on there. But these are the ones that basically you got bolts out here holding them on. You know, you got holes in these hubs that line up that you can turn to line up with those, and then you pull that out, and then that Rockwell chunk comes out. You know, I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. There's only so much an axle can take, though, and the weak link of the chain, when somebody starts hot rodding, and you know, whenever you build more and more powerful engines, and you're thinking that the drive line, you know, my dad used to say that Volkswagen Bugs had a transaxle that was 3 times as strong as the engine. In other words, they would handle an engine 3 times as strong as the engine they put in the car. Well, if you keep powering up your engine, you're basically going to have stuff like this is going to happen. You're going to find a weak link in the chain, and sometimes you don't like where it is. But sometimes you just got to stop and you just got to fix it. You know, this guy right here is, you know, probably in Vietnam or somewhere, and those people can do amazing things with almost no resources over there. And they can fix stuff that we wouldn't even want to try to do out of necessity. That's what people do, because human beings are adaptable, and we can figure out how to make something work, you know. Now this is one I saw, this Myco brake lock. We had this international truck that had an 8-liter diesel engine in it, it was 10.5. And the people at the, well, there was, at the fleet maintenance place down there was these people that, we call them pumpers, you know. They had people, with the mud pumping and fuel pumping and all this kind of stuff. They did things like that. And they borrowed the truck that we were using for a service truck because they needed to use a pump that was on the truck. And so I was told whenever we got the truck that we wanted to put this Myco brake lock on there. What you do there is you hook that into the brake lines. Brake lines are going to go through this, and then if you want to lock, you flip that lever over, and then you stomp the brake a couple of times. The fluid is trapped at this valve, and the brakes are held really solid with fluid pressure. And that's what that basically was right there. And Myco brake lock thing, lever lock, is what they call it. And you know, basically lock and unlock. Well, I put that on that truck and showed the guys in the first shift how to operate that Myco brake lock. Well, they did not think to tell the people in the second shift how to unlock the Myco brake lock. So when they tried to drive the truck out of there, they just kept jerking it around with the brakes locked and trying it with that big powerful 8-liter diesel engine until they twisted an axle off out there like that, and I had to replace that axle shaft, and that was a great deal of fun. But anyway, I managed to make that happen, but that micro brake lock was what caused that on that 8-liter International. I mean, it was a Lodestar something or another. I can't remember. It was like a 81 model, and boy, that thing was powerful. This happens in traffic, you know. Typically the axle failed or the C-clip failed or something like that, you know. When you think about it, that's a sort of a dangerous thing, especially, imagine if you were going 80 miles an hour in Atlanta, you know, trying to keep in flow with the traffic. Something like that happened. That's bad news. All right, so the CV joint instead of a regular joint, you basically have these little channels here and these balls, these cage in there. You can actually take one of these apart. I used to have a bunch of these that were cleaned up and dry, and I would put them in there on the tables in the classroom, and I have the students take those CV joints apart and put them back together. And it's basically, after you've done it a few times, it's not that hard to do. But this works better than this if you're going to be turning real sharp. If you're going to be turning real sharp, this is going to go faster and slower and faster and slower and faster and slower. If you've ever used a wiggler on an impact wrench and tried to bend it a little too sharp, you can tell how it's doing all this stuff. Well, on this, you can bend it up to 45 degrees, and it's going to give you a good steady pull because these balls roll in these channels. Now, the inner CV joint is only a plunger. It moves a little bit, doesn't bend as sharp as this outer one does, but it can plunge because when you're going over, you know, rough terrain or whatever, or the suspension on the car's working, whether it's the drive shaft or whether it's the axle or whatever that's connected to the wheels. If two things are moving, this is going to have to continue to transmit torque while it gets longer and shorter. And that's what the plunging joints on the inside of these CV axles are for. The outside ones enable it to keep delivering torque while you're turning. And what happens, these little balls wear little dimples in here, and that's why they go clickety clickety click when they start to wear out and you turn. These boots will rupture a little bit. We used to just replace the boots and stuff, and so those are nowadays it only costs about $65, or that's what it was costing last time I bought one, for a whole axle assembly. So it's just easier to buy a whole axle assembly if you can come up with one. Now, back in the 70s, they were putting these joints, they put these double joints on there. They put a joint here and another joint there with a collar in between them. Lincolns, some of the GM cars, higher end ones would do that because it was a smoother thing than, I mean, it gave them more of a constant velocity joint kind of a thing. And that's something you don't really see a whole lot of anymore, but there are some of those that were doing that. On some of the Lexus vehicles, they just have a big rubber flange kind of a thing back there. Now you got to understand the different styles. This is the one where the axle support the weight of the vehicle. That's your, you know, semi-floater and all that. And once again, this is the one where you don't have C-clips in there on this one. You just reach through there and unbolt this, and you pull it out. When you pull it out that far, you know, you can actually change the seal without having to take the rear cover off and disassemble the rear end to get the axles out. It's pretty handy right there. That's the old, what I call the old chunk or the Rockwell style. That's this one here. See that? And I really like these because you could set your backlash with these nuts. Dodge always liked to do that kind of thing. And so, and then once you get your backlash set and your preload, the preload is how much pressure is on the bearings whenever they're not even turning. And backlash, you tighten this one and loosen the other one the same amount. Now on the Ford, you get shims in there, and some of the Chevrolets. You basically would put shims on the inside, inside these cups and all. But that's, you know, I'm not going to go into all that detail. This is just a quickie. You're only supposed to use matched sets. Now I will tell you, there was this old guy over there at the Ford place, and there was a noisy rear end that had mismatched gears. If those gears get to moving around, like when the bearing preload's off, and you drive them too long like that, it will mismatch those gears. The wear pattern will mess them up so that they're noisy. They'll look just fine and be noisy as all get out, singing and all that crap. Well, what this guy did is he basically drained all the oil out of that differential. It was like a 1.5 ton truck. You're going to think this is crazy. I don't know if I'd try this, but his name was Buford, and he jacked this thing up and he put it in so the wheels were off the ground. And he had the the gears all dried off, and he smeared valve grinding compound all over the teeth on the gears. Just coated them good with valve grinding compound, the whole entire gear. And then he put that thing in gear, and he let those wheels spin with that valve grinding compound working between that gear and that one. Just kept on letting it go. I mean, like 4 hours, maybe 5, all afternoon or whatever. And then he cleaned all of that stuff off of there and just washed it out, got all the valve grinding compound out of it real good. And he put it back together with oil, and it was just as quiet. Took care of that. He matched the gears to one another by lapping them with valve grinding compound. Now, you know, some of the old used car people, you know, they used to claim would, you know, stuff bananas and sawdust and all in the rear end to make them quiet. But anyway, all right. Shock failure. You got a rough trailer hookup, spinning the wheels, grabbing on the firm road, trying to free up the frozen brakes and so on. You know, you're going to be, if you're snatching it, you're liable to bust that gear. And that's something you can do. You know, you might notice this one's got more holes in it than you usually see too. Granular fracture surface right here, you know, he's going to bust off like that. You know, I could give you the reasons for all these, but I mean, it varies from situation to situation. And here's a shock failure, similar to what I was talking about. Now this right here, you might notice, is actually a pinion gear. This is not the axle, this is the pinion gear. And with that bearing on there. There's another shock failure. Yeah, you know, and this is the tooth. You see, as a matter of fact, I was thinking that this gear, see, this gear's busted too. All right, so you got, this is called as beach marks, because that looks like a beach, right? Overloading the vehicle beyond the rated capacity will chip and break the stuff like that. Abusive operation, that makes a horrible noise whenever you got one like that. Incidentally, that ring gear has also got to be not out of round. It needs to be, and you can check that with a dial indicator. There's your fatigue crack right there where it's ready to break, but it didn't quite. And sometimes you'll have a star or a spiral fracture based on, and that's actually also a pinion, and not it's not an axle, it's a pinion gear. All right, this is what I was talking about earlier. You know, where you kind of scribe this, and then or you, whenever you can hit it with a regular. This is a screwdriver, but you can hit it with a chisel right there. When it cracks, you can spread that. It'll come right on off there. And, you know, then you put it back on. That one there, there's a puller you got right here that you can pull it off with if you got one of those. And they're all different kind of. But you can see it's really difficult to get a puller under here if you don't have one that's specially made, you know, to grip it on, just on that very lip right there. So if you're going to replace a brittle bearing like that anyway, just bust it off of there. And this is your backlash check. How much space the gear's got. Usually you're looking for about 10 to 20 thousandths. Click, 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 like that with your dial indicator. You notice you're going to see how far those will turn. Now some of them require this big old thing here, and I had one of those at the college to spread the case so you can get those gears out of there, because if you don't have this, getting them out and getting them back in is a kind of a booger bear. And you basically put these pins in here, bolt them in, and then you turn this and that spreads that case. If you spread the case too much, or if it's an aluminum case, if you're supposed to measure how much you're spreading it, or be really, really, really careful, or you will ruin that case. You got to be really careful, particularly if the case is aluminum. And a lot of vehicles now have got aluminum differential cases, and they'll have CV axles coming out the sides. And if this is aluminum, do not put a floor jack under this aluminum housing, or you will ruin it. Okay, and this is like on my Explorer. I put no floor jack under there. If you can't find the specs and the tag is gone, count the pinion and ring gear teeth to find the ratio. You'll usually be real close, because it's not going to be, it'll be like little steps on that particular vehicle between it. So if you had an 11-tooth pinion gear and a 50-tooth ring gear, what the ratio would be? 50 teeth here, 11 teeth here. You're going to multiply that to, divide that by this, and that's going to be 454 to 1. That's your gear ratio. That's one of them race car ratios, right? All right, now when it's leaking, look at this vent. If that vent's all clogged up with dirt and crud, and you got a leak right here, if you replace this seal, then this right here could very well have been the cause of it. And on this video that I'm going to give you, point you to in a minute, that's what was wrong. If you've got a leak, and let's say you take the plug out of there to put differential grease in there, and you feel that it's got pressure in it, then that's telling you that the vent is clogged. Now sometimes you'll have a piece of hose on there and all that, but I'll show you what I did and how I found a bad, clogged vent on that Crown Victoria that I replaced that seal on right there. Now, setting the pinion bearing, preload, and ring gear backlash is an art more than a science. Is the gear contact pattern that tells you it's right, and it's supposed to look like that. Now, if it's way down here or way up here, you got issues, or if it's too far this way, there's a whole lot of different adjustments there. And I can, you got to paint that. Just paint it like you're painting your porch with some kind of red grease or Prussian blue or something like that. Just turn it through by hand and see what it looks like, see what the pattern looks like, and then you'll know kind of what you're going to, when you get it set right, you won't have noise and it'll be good and strong and all that. Incorrect tire inflation pressure, multiple tire sizes being used, uneven tire wear can cause those little differential gears to just go crazy in there. One time somebody poked a knife in my tire when I was parked over close to a country store down there in, not far south of here. I stopped in there to go into my father-in-law's house, came back out, there was a knife. Somebody poked a knife in the sidewall. I had to put the donut on there, what you're supposed to do when you change a tire on a front wheel drive car. If it's a front tire that's flat, unless some of these cars have got a spare that's the same size as the other tires, like on some of the Cadillacs, but you're supposed to take a tire from the rear and put it on the front because the transaxle gears will just go completely nuts. Like some of your Hondas and Toyotas will tell you to do that, or you may destroy the little spider gears in there, because those things aren't supposed to be operating unless you're turning, or if you've got one tire smaller than the other one, they're going to be operating. But you can actually ruin one of those Hondas by putting a donut on the drive axle end of it. And on that Taurus, when I actually put the donut on mine because I wasn't going very far, but I could hear those spider gears just raising cane in there whenever I did that. Anyway, I didn't do it right, but I wasn't going very far either. And that's what I was talking about. The donut is really bad for the differential. So anyway, you can do a search for this video here, replacing a differential rear end seal. It's on my channel. It's one of the first ones I ever put on there. It's had nearly 700,000 people have watched it or something like that. And it's not very long. I think it's like 6 minutes long. So you might want to have a look at that, because I got a guy helping me, and we went ahead and, one of my students he could have been doing something else that day, but he came in to help me. And he comes across as a little dense, but he's really a pretty smart guy, Differential seals leak, vents clog, bearings growl, gears whine. They need regular maintenance, and you better make sure you're using the right kind of oil and you keep them full. If you've got a leak, you need to fix it, because it will go low and you'll wind up without oil and have to buy some parts. Alright, that is the end of this video, and I will see you guys next time, and I really appreciate you stopping by.